This is the early access for Siralim Ultimate, and this has actually been a pretty cool journey to be on because very rarely do you get to actually see a very small development team create their own sort of niche, carve themselves out in the industry game by game. And this is really a very, very small development team that's responsible for this, as in it's mostly just one guy and some freelance artists and things to help along with the projects. And yet he's managed to make a 4-game series out of this when we are now on the 4th entry. And I think Ultimate is a pretty good subtitle for it because it really is the sort of the culmination of the efforts of all the things learned, of all the iterations and innovations that the series has made up to this point into one big effort to create just a huge RPG that includes everything that they've done and learned so far. And that's exactly what Siralim Ultimate is. It is a dungeon crawling RPG, a monster catching RPG. It's actually reminiscent of something like Dragon Warrior or the old Megami Tensei games a little bit, but I've noticed that this particular entry has some other more modern influences as well, sort of shot throughout some of the new stuff that's in it. Games like Diablo and Path of Exile come to mind as big inspirations for some of the newer mechanics that are in this entry. But this isn't going to be a super crazy end-game review or anything like that because 1, it's still in early access, but 2, these games are very, very long. If you want to get to the really, really end-game stuff, you're talking like hundreds of hours, and they try to even include stuff that will occupy players for thousands if possible, so there's a lot to these games, and this one in particular is definitely the biggest of the bunch in terms of what's actually going to be available. And even though it is in early access, a lot of that stuff is currently available, just not all of the super end-game stuff yet. That's still to be fleshed out a bit. So this video is going to be more about the state of the early access, the beginning of the game, and I'm going to have to do some more videos later on in the lifespan of the campaign to show you some later stuff, because that just takes a long time to get to. These games are complex and they're huge. But let's start with what is Siralim for someone who's never played it before. Well, you start by creating a character and choosing a class, and after you've chosen your class, which will determine what sorts of passive perks will become available to you later, you will begin with a creature dependent on the type of class that you chose. Creatures have 5 different main types, and these are separate from species and groups and things like that. There are just these 5 overarching types, which are sorcery, life, death, nature, and chaos. And these, in my opinion at least, have always been very reminiscent of the colors of mana and Magic the Gathering. That seems like, to me at least, what they're sort of inspired by, at least partially. The way that the creature archetypes work, the way that the spell gems, which also have these types, work, they all seem to have similar themes to the 5 colors of mana. So that's how I like to think of them, at least. It helps me organize them in my mind a little bit better, especially when there are this many creatures, because as of this entry there are over 1,200 creatures for you to find, all of which can be put into your team. And you'll be creating a team of 6 creatures and facing off against teams of 6 creatures as well, although it doesn't immediately start you off against like 6v6. You'll have to build up your team first, and the enemy groupings they'll generally match the amount that you have, so you won't be like totally screwed at the beginning facing off against 6 creatures when you only have 2 or something like that, making it really, really hard to start. And every creature has a whole bunch of different things. It has stats like health, attack, intelligence, defense, speed, all that stuff that you would expect. It's also got a passive trait. Every single creature has a passive trait, and they're all different. You'll notice that there are generally groups of traits where there are certain, kind of like actually another Magic the Gathering influence, possibly sort of like the tribes in Magic, where you have goblins or hellions or worms. They all tend to have certain traits in common, and this game does a similar thing with its traits. Although every single trait for every creature is different, they do share some themes, some sort of similar themes between them, depending on the type and tribe of the creature. So, for instance, you may find that there are certain tribes of creatures that are very good at manipulating spells on the battlefield in some way, different creatures doing it in different ways, or a set of creatures that do different things if your creatures dodge attacks. There's an entire tribe of creatures, a whole species effectively related to having dodging capabilities and some sort of retaliation or counterattacking or other skills, depending on which individual creature you're talking about, after you dodge. And you'll want to take advantage of your 6 team slots to create a nicely synergistic, powerful combination of creatures and traits that also synergize with your character's class and what you can do, since although you're not on the battlefield technically, like your character doesn't take damage, you still can cast spells, and you have all sorts of passive capabilities that affect how your creatures fight, so you want to combine all of these together to create a powerful team. Creatures can, of course, equip spell gems to cast spells, and they can also equip artifacts, which are, like swords, shields, staves, that sort of thing, stuff that can be upgraded to have all kinds of extra passive slots on it, and it will also have its own percentage stat-based increases. So, a creature that does a lot of physical attacking, you may want to increase their attack and defense, and so on and so forth. And all of this means that there's a lot of complexity and about a bajillion different team combinations that you could come up with depending on what sort of character you want to play and what you actually want to do. And after all this, the games are basically overflowing with depth because there's just so much stuff to see and do. You have, of course, all of your artifacts. You want to upgrade the artifacts, and every time you upgrade artifacts to a certain level, they will open up new slots that you can socket different kinds of materials into for different effects. So you can, over time, vastly improve and completely customize every single artifact that you have to be a really good fit for whatever creature you want to give it to. And of course, there are also the spell gems. These give each of your creatures new spells that they can cast in battle, but the spell gems themselves can also be upgraded and socketed with other materials separate from the artifact ones that will give the spells different new capabilities. Something as simple as just using a different stat for part of its casting requirement, so it does more damage based on the amount of attack or the amount of speed a creature has, for instance, to make it more fit for a certain member of your team, or something as advanced as making it echo and chain and bounce around the place and do all sorts of other stuff that might synergize with some stuff that your character can do. And in the middle of all this, you're also going through these various realms. This is one of the first big differences from the previous games that you're going to notice if you've played them. There are twice as many realms for you to visit now. In the previous game, there were 15, now there are 30. So that's 30 different tile sets, 30 realms, and of course 30 gods, because every realm has its own god that commands it, and you are meant to go around these realms and appease those gods by talking to their statues and doing missions for them. And as you will do these things and also explore their realms, you'll get favor with each one, and as you get favor, you can exchange emblems or tokens that belong to that god to them for new things. And the higher up in their favors you get, the more cool stuff they'll give you, up to and including stuff like avatars of themselves that can become extremely powerful creatures if you make it that far. But what about some stuff that's different? Stuff that is different from the previous game or just different for the series in general? New things. Well, first off, there's a new decoration system where you can actually customize your castle tile by tile if you want. You can change the floor tiles, change the wall tiles, expand it to be even larger and contain new rooms. You can put decorations like chairs or tables or altars related to the various gods that you've appeased and met throughout your adventure so far, and other stuff. And you can also get all kinds of new NPCs and new functional things to put in your castle as well, to provide yourselves with new and upgraded functions, new NPC services, and all kinds of things like that. So there's a very large decoration system in the game now that's going to last until the end game, because you're going to be finding all sorts of new crazy stuff that you can make or add to your castle. There's also a project system which involves some of these upgrades, hiring new NPCs, expanding your castle, and so forth, where you will have to start these projects and then go into various realms and collect resources during your other questing, so you can do them at the same time, and eventually you'll be rewarded with a new upgrade or a new expansion to your castle or whatever it is the project was building. There are now relics, which are these big passive items that can be upgraded a lot and affect all of your creatures in very large ways. There's this thing called the Rhodian Creature Master system, which the forum post says to think of it like Pokemon gym leaders on steroids. That's basically what it is, so just use your imagination on that one. That'll be interesting. You can also get new skins for your creatures so that they can look different. And I mentioned some Diablo and Path of Exile sort of influences, and some of the stuff for that, the Nether Stones, the developer even admits, is actually a bit of Diablo flair to the game. Nether Stones are big bonuses that can be found and socketed into artifacts. So think of them like huge, like mid to end game upgrades that'll have random stats to them that make a huge difference when you actually socket them into something. There's also something new called the Realm Shaping system, which is what I'm thinking is sort of a Path of Exile influence, maybe a little bit, and it involves actually altering each of the realms. It works for all 30 of them, and unlocking new events for them, and altering the amount of treasure and stuff you find, as well as just overall making them even more difficult for greater rewards. Siralim is very much based on risk-reward. They have been since the first game, with systems that involve basically being on a roll, things that if you continue to delve deeper and deeper, you'll get better and better rewards, and if you're able to continue throughout your adventures without dying, you'll amplify those rewards. So risk-reward systems, mechanics that involve making things more difficult for yourself but giving you better rewards in return, are pretty common in this series, and that's definitely another one to add to the list. That sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. Another huge new thing is creature synthesis. You can actually combine creatures. This is something that you unlock very early in the game, actually, which is appreciated, and it allows you to combine two creatures that you own into one new one. And the really cool thing about this is it actually gives the new creature both of the parent's traits, so those unique passive traits that every creature has. Fused creatures will have two of them. and they will also inherit the sort of average of their stats. They'll also inherit the appearance of both parents. So they'll have the sprite of the first parent, and then they'll have 4 different choosable color palettes based on the sprite work of the other parent. So this allows you to create some pretty unique looking creatures, because although it will be using the same sprite as one of them, the overall color scheme will be completely different. And that's also, by the way, another thing to mention about this game. I said there are over 1,200 creatures, and not only is that true, but there are also none of them that are palette swaps. There are creatures that are in the same species that have similar sprites, so that, you know, they look recognizably similar, so that you know that they're in the same family, but none of them actually reuse the same sprite and just color it differently. All creatures have at least some form of a unique sprite, which is a lot of work, so I think that that deserves some admiration. There are also 30 classes in the game, each with their own pretty large list of passive things that you can upgrade to affect your team, and you can actually change classes at any time once you unlock a certain NPC, so that's cool. There's going to be a guild system, which allows you to actually gain reputation in various guilds across the world to unlock new creatures and spells and decorations and the like, depending on the guild that you're going for. And there are even going to be some accessories for your creatures, things like auras, pets you can bring along and the like, that allow you to customize the appearance of your creatures even further. So yeah, the game is huge. Even though it's currently in early access, it is still huge. And if you've played a Siralim game in the past, if you've played through some of the early access periods of previous games, you'll know that they tend to work very fast. They add a lot of stuff, they listen to a lot of community feedback, and the developer really takes a lot of stuff into consideration and is very, very good at creating a polished, finished experience at the end of it. This is the kind of early access that I feel is very trustworthy, because they've done it multiple times before very successfully, and I don't see why this one would be any different, especially when it's already starting off in such a content-rich state to begin with. In fact, they've already started squashing bugs and taking community suggestions, and there have already been a few small updates to that effect, and there are going to be even more soon, including one that's going to solve one of the problems that I was going to mention in this video, the fact that there's an entire class, the class that I'm playing, Evoker, that's based around like echoing spells, repeating spellcasts, and it tends to waste a lot of the point of the class by repeating spells on already dead enemies, but this is something that they're already aware of and they're already working on a fix for. So I don't really have any complaints as far as the game goes right now. I'm only about 10 hours into it, which in Siralim terms is absolutely nothing, but I'm definitely enjoying it so far. And if you're looking for a hardcore turn-based like retro style RPG, especially a creature collecting RPG that's going to take up a whole bunch of your time, and you really want a good RPG time sink, then I'd say look no further, because this is definitely a great culmination of the previous game's efforts and everything that's been learned so far to create something that I think is going to be the best one in the series, if it isn't already, to be honest, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So expect some more coverage on this as I get farther in the game and the game gets farther along, because there's always a lot to show with these games, and it's hard to fit it all into one video, especially when I've only had a small amount of time to actually work on it so far. So that is Siralim Ultimate. I would absolutely recommend taking a look at it right now. The game is actually not going to get more expensive once the early access period is over, so if you want to check it out, well, there's already a crap load of content in it, so you're not really going to be missing out on anything, and this is the kind of developer that has had a lot of success on early access in the past, creating some really enjoyable and pretty unique experiences. These sorts of games don't come along very often, especially games with this sort of dizzying amount of depth that the Siralim games have. So definitely go check it out if you're at all into like turn-based RPGs of this sort. You will be doing yourself a favor to get into it and seeing what it has to offer. The link will be in the description below this video if you want to go do that. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.